The silent killer of strategy in organizations isn't bad ideas. It's unclear communication, and leaders don't even know that it's happening. My name is Ben Rosner, and I have lived this out myself. My background is in executive, corporate, and crisis communications across the military, top global companies, the United Nations, and startups. In the Israel Defense Forces, I was head of strategy and crisis communications during times of war and peace, leading the strategic communications of the military, deciding what it is that we're going to say, how we're going to say it, who we're going to say it to, and advising some of the top brass while doing it. I was also at a strategic and corporate communications agency in New York City, where I advised Fortune 500 companies. So think of anything from financial transactions, meaning they either have deals, there might be an IPO, to any type of crisis situation that might harm the reputation of the company and their ability to earn money, all the way through to just regular old reputation building, meaning how do we change the perception of the company in the minds of its most important stakeholders? At the United Nations and also the Foreign Ministry for Israel, I was a speechwriter, a policy advisor, and really figuring out how do we communicate the message of Israel to the most international forums possible and to its most important stakeholders on the global stage. And then lastly, advising startups everywhere from Series A to C. Uh, the startups I've advised over time have raised more than $500 million combined, increased their sizes by hundreds of employees, and ultimately made their mark on the market. And similarly, helping advise the venture capital firms and the private equity companies that back them. And this is something that I've done for over 15 years. So this is the experience from which I speak from. But it's also important to know that it didn't start this way. In fact, when I was 8 years old, I mean, I couldn't speak English until I was 10 years old. When I was born, and for the first few years of my life, I lived in Israel. And then my parents, they took us from just a small little farming community in northern Israel all the way to Baltimore, Maryland when I was 8 years old. And I knew intimately the frustration and the pain and anxiety of what it was like to not be able to communicate with anyone until I was 10 years old. And it was tough and it was frustrating, but I simply chose to rewrite my narrative and what I did with my life. And today, um, helping leaders communicate effectively to achieve their goals is my personal passion. And I work with C-suite executives and senior leadership teams to translate complex strategy into clear communication so that they can push their businesses forward. And I've seen time and time again that leaders confuse their good strategy and their good ideas as being the problem and for them failing, when in fact it's actually their unclear communication that leads to that failure. And so if you want to ensure that your strategy succeeds flawlessly so that you can scale your company, build aligned teams, and earn trust from your most important stakeholders, then this video is for you. I'm going to show you how to avoid the situation where you confuse your strategy and ideas for the actual communication process that gets you there. So if you really care about it, then this video is for you. I'm going to share with you the Clarity Flywheel, which is used by the most successful companies and leaders on earth to be able to get rid of confusion, provide the clarity to their most important stakeholders so that you can ultimately just fast forward to enjoying the scale, to enjoy the efficiency and the ROI that you want while being recognized as the trusted and authentic leader that you are. So let's jump right into it. Uh, by the way, these tips and this framework, so many leaders have told me over time that they wished that they knew it earlier, because it's something that if you're able to fix, especially the way that your messages move through your company, everything else that you have scales faster. And that's ultimately what we want to be able to get to. So let's begin with the problem that we see today. So this is research that's been provided by and conducted by Harvard Business Review, by McKinsey, and some of this stuff is incredibly concerning, especially when it comes to building, scaling, communicating within companies. And most importantly, if employees can't trust leaders to have a plan, communicate it well, and lead through uncertain times, the organization's stability or the organization's ability to function suffers. Employees begin to question the organization's direction, mission, and goals, leading to doubt and misalignment. That is the biggest issue when it comes to clarity, when it comes to communication, when it comes to being able to get to all those desired outcomes that you want in the business. Doubt and misalignment. So some of the biggest problems within it, if we start to break down this problem, is understanding that one of the pillars of the issues is that the quality of communications is poor. Now, here are some ways in which poor communication or miscommunication leads to those issues. The first is that you end up having delays or failures in project completion. 44%, that's an absolutely absurd number, simply because an idea wasn't communicated well enough. You end up seeing in companies that they miss their goals. That's 31%, or they end up losing their sales, 25%. And we're not talking about lead came in, they weren't qualified, it wasn't the right prospect for us. They just lost it because of poor communication. And so when you look at this overall, it's no wonder that you have trust being at an all-time low. In fact, only 7% of workers strongly agree that communication in their workplace is accurate, timely, and open. That means that 93% think that it's not. 93% do not agree that they have open, strong, and timely communication. And that's a huge problem. If one of the goals that we have along the way to achieving our outcomes is building aligned teams and earning trust, this is the absolute wrong way to do it. And when you think about, okay, so I have poor communication within the company that's leading to all of these issues. Okay, I need to ensure that I get rid of doubt and misalignment. What can I point to? What are some of the problems that lead to this in the first place? And McKinsey found that when it comes to any type of transformation in organizations, 70% of organizations fail. Not half achieve, not get there a little bit. They fail when it comes to transformation because they don't attach a why to their effort. Why are we doing this? What is the reason for this? What is the vision? How is it going to impact me? These are critical aspects to understand. And so it can be large scale transformation, but it could also be a go-to-market motion. You're launching a new product. You want to change the culture of your company, whatever that might be that requires communication to the entire firm. If there's no why attached, it's simply going to fail. So the question is, why is this happening? If these are the problems, if these are the things that we see manifested in terms of the issues from delays, missed goals, lost sales, lack of trust from workers when it comes to the communication, the fact that these transformations fail, what actually leads to that? And there's something that I've come up with here that I call the intent to impact gap. And so this is the delta between what leaders think they communicated and what their audience actually internalized, repeated, and acted on. So this is the difference between what you meant, what you wanted people to understand, what you wanted employees, team members, leaders to do, and what they actually ended up doing. And the wider the gap, the bigger the issue. The smaller that gap, the closer they are to undertaking exactly what it is that you wanted. And this is critical to understand because this gap between the intent and impact, that is where millions of dollars are lost in execution. And the bigger that gap, the more money that is lost. Imagine that you just launched a product. Engineering heard one thing, marketing another, sales a third, and each one is going in their own direction. And while your goal might have been X, they were all much closer to Y. And so it's no wonder that the bigger that gap between what you want and what all these departments are doing would lead to an unsuccessful launch, or even launches half as good as what you wanted it to be. And so what could have been tens of millions of dollars in revenue, or even $1 million, it doesn't matter. It ends up being significantly lower than what you expected. And that's why our goal is to try to tighten this gap, shorten it as much as we can, so that what is that we want to happen actually takes place. And there's an important caveat that I really want to hone in on here, and that is that so many executives that I work with, they believe that they're already clear in what is it they do. Or what is it they say. So they'll come to me and say, well, Ben, I'm already clear. I've told people what they need to do and they just need to execute it. Now, that in and of itself, that statement makes it seem as though we are either clear or unclear, right? So that there's a binary here, clear or unclear. But the thing is, when it comes to communication, these things aren't about a binary. They're actually a continuum. It's not, am I clear or am I not clear? It's how clear am I? So for example, if I wanted someone to make their bed like a 5-star hotel, that's when I know somebody has really achieved what I wanted from an impact perspective. But I just tell them like, hey, I need you to go make your bed. Okay. So maybe they just folded the sheets, put them at the bottom of the bed, and that was the end of the day. But that's not what you wanted. So you weren't very clear, and therefore that intent to impact gap was very wide. But if you instead took the time and said, hey, listen, I need you to make your bed like a 5-star hotel. And when I say a 5-star hotel, I mean you fluff the pillows, the bed sheets are perfectly tucked in, the duvet has no wrinkles, maybe even throw a mint or a chocolate onto that pillow. I'm being incredibly clear with what I want, what I expect to happen, and what things need to look like. And so therefore, I am much higher on the continuum. I'm being much clearer. And so therefore, it would assume that we can narrow that intent to impact gap because I've been incredibly clear. So again, both ways we've told somebody, I need you to make your bed. However, there's a clear difference in how clear we were in the instructions of doing so. And our goal in anything that we do, in any communication that we have internally and externally, is to narrow the intent to impact gap as much as we can. Here's some things that widen this impact gap, which we want to avoid, obviously. And the very first thing that's important to understand is that there's a lot of noise in organizations. We're talking about structural noise in particular, meaning you have a communication that flows down the organization to all the different parts of the firm. You have communication between departments, one to each other. That could be marketing, it could be sales, customer success, what have you. That could be communication between an individual contributor and a manager across different departments. And so just naturally by existing in any type of matrix organization, you have a lot of structural noise that adds and compounds to so much information being absorbed by an individual. And what I think is really interesting when you look at communication pathways, meaning all the different ways in which communications flow through an organization, when you just look at 20 here in this particular diagram, just 20 people on their own. So think about a smaller startup, just a Series A, for example. You can have nearly 196 pathways, which is an absurd number. And this thing only grows the larger the organization. So take it as a given that just by existing, organizations have a lot of noise. The second is that we are constantly bombarded with cognitive overload. So in this situation, you have tons of emails, Slack messages, text messages, phone calls every single day trying to take our attention from both the task at hand and also the information that we're receiving from those above us about what is that we need to be doing to be able to accomplish the goals that we need. Then we have the third thing, which is a feedback vacuum. So something that happens a lot in organizations is that whether it's the CEO or any type of executive leader, all they do is they communicate outwards. They just broadcast to everybody around them, but they themselves don't have a mechanism. There's no way by which that they receive information back. And so you have this circle around them, this fortress that creates the vacuum because they just make an assumption that everybody knows what it is that they want. But they in turn don't actually know what's going on in the organization and how well their messages and the communication has been received. So that feedback vacuum is a third thing that widens the intent to impact vacuum. And then lastly, leaders, I've seen this again and again. They're overconfident in their abilities and they have this illusion of clarity. Now, most of the leaders that I've worked with over my life, They're good communicators. They are very confident communicators, but they assume that just by saying something, it has been received. And that is just far from the case. Because just like we saw before, clarity isn't binary. It's not yes or no. It's not as clear as unclear. It's how clear were you? And I think a lot of leaders just have an overconfidence about how clear they were in whatever it is that they've been saying. And again, a lot of it's not their fault. In the same way that we are, employees specifically, are bombarded with so much cognitive overload, there is a lot that it's on a leader's shoulders to constantly bear. And so we at times default to, okay, the strategy is what I need to work on, all this work, making sure this happens, execution, that's what matters. The communication, that's an afterthought. That just comes second. And that's why the clarity that we typically communicate with isn't as strong as it could be. And that's why that leads to the overconfidence issue that I see over and over again at firms. So overconfidence, we have to deal with that. And then there's the illusion of clarity. So according to McKinsey, leaders are eight times more likely to believe that their organization communicated effectively than their teams were. So again, there's this vacuum that's created. There's this overconfidence about how well things are traveling within the organization. And it's not reflective of reality. And when you combine all of these four elements, it's no wonder that you have an intent to impact gap that simply widens. And again, that gap is where so many millions of dollars are lost. It's where we then have an issue where we confuse our strategy or our ideas as not being good enough, as being the reasons for why something failed, and saying, okay, we got to jump to the next strategy. We have to have a better idea. When in fact, it's really the communication itself. So what does this look like in organizations? How is it that this clarity looks like as it flows through an organization? So I want to show you the intent to impact gap. So specifically why messages lose meaning as they travel down the organization. And I want to, first of all, draw your attention here to the bottom to what I call message distortion. This means that as messages flow down from leadership all the way down to an individual contributor to company, the messages get distorted, kind of like a game of telephone, if the clarity and if the steps are not followed to make them as clear as possible. So imagine a scenario where a leader comes in and they say, I want to have a culture change. I want to make sure that the way in which we act at this firm, the way in which we behave, all of that is going to be refreshed. I want to have a lot more accountability. I want to have responsibility for everybody. I want there to be collaboration, right? So they're really excited. They have a big vision. And so their focus is on behaviors. It's on the way in which people act at scale in this company. However, we have the first layer of distortion that's not done properly. And so we go from the leadership level to the manager interpretation. And managers, when they hear something like, oh, we're going to have a culture change, instead of thinking about it from a values perspective, from a behavior perspective, they might hear people and they might hear process and they might hear organization. And so for them, the message is, oh, well, it sounds like we have restructuring that's on the horizon. And so when they then go, these managers, these senior leaders, then communicate down to the different teams, you have another layer of distortion. So they're talking about how restructuring is coming. But the way that the teams understand it, restructuring is just a different word for layoffs. And so now people believe, oh my gosh, the company's not doing well. Or there's a new vision on the horizon and I don't have a place in the new world in which this leader wants to take us in. So now people believe that there are layoffs on the horizon. And then we get to the final level of message distortion where individuals, they have anxiety that starts to take hold. And so their focus is on the perceived layoff, not knowing whether they will be able to continue this company, not knowing if their position is safe, not knowing whether they're going to matter now that there's going to be this massive cultural change that the leadership team wants. And so that leads to work critical work that needs to happen that suffers because the focus is all over the place. And all of this just because the leader wanted culture change, something that's an incredibly positive thing. But because the methods distortion was not addressed going from the top down, this is what took place. And so leaders see misalignment and blame strategy or execution. But what they're really seeing is communication distortion, because I think most of us would agree focusing on culture, focusing on positive behaviors at an organization, the idea is not the problem. That's great. But if it's not communicated well, it's very clear to see how all of that can be distorted. And so it became evident to me that when it comes to communication, it's not speech, it's systems. And that was most true in one of the most exciting, harrowing, difficult financial transactions that I've ever been a part of. And so the example I want to give you is a case study in communications infrastructure. So this is Takeda's $62 billion acquisition around 2018. Takeda Pharmaceuticals, which is a Japanese company that was headed by French CEO, was going to buy Shire. And we're talking about a transaction that was historic in terms of its size and scale. This was a top 10 deal by size, right? $62 billion. So ever since the year 2000, it's been in the top 10. It was historic, and there were a lot of complications around it, and especially because of the UK takeover code, which I'm not going to bore you with, but the long and the short of it is that this entire transaction needed to be completed within 6 weeks. And I remember viscerally what it was like to just work non-stop, where the days blurred together. This was literal 18-hour days every single day. This is not like, oh, I worked hard, it was 18 hours. No, this was 18 hours every single day. Head hit the pillow at midnight, rose at 6 a.m., and we do it again and again and again. Days didn't matter, weekends didn't exist. This just needs to be completed. And part of the challenge was, how do we communicate to tens of thousands of employees across 12 time zones? And especially when it came to the objectives that we needed to make this a successful acquisition. When it came to our objectives as a corporate communications firm, the very first thing we had to do was to craft the vision and the purpose for the acquisition. So back for when we were discussing the McKinsey research, 70% of any type of transformations failed because there's no why. And so here there needed to be a why. Why is this historic Japanese company buying a UK-based smaller pharma company? So there needed to be the why. What is the vision? What is the purpose? How will it help how will it help the pipeline? Will it help patients all around the world? What are the benefits of doing this? The second is that we needed to create global messaging that resonated with all stakeholders. So this meant the employees themselves. This meant getting that alignment and buy-in from shareholders, from employees, analysts, journalists. Everybody needed to buy into this vision, buy into the purpose of this acquisition, and to get on board so that we can ultimately make it successful. Because if there was any type of misalignment anywhere, this thing would fail, just completely flat on its face, and it wouldn't be accepted. And then lastly, we had to ensure a perfect rollout of the communications across the globe. Again, 12 different time zones, multiple different languages, so many different employees and cultures that needed to receive a message in a way that would prompt them to action, to influence their behavior, or persuade them to think a certain way. Here it was to understand the importance of this transaction. And again, it led to a historic acquisition. I couldn't be more proud of the work that we did here. I think it really changed pharma for the better in a lot of different ways. But again, the bottom line for me, the main takeaway that I had, like I said before, it showed that clarity isn't speech. I think so much of when people talk about communication, whether it's executive, corporate, leadership, they think it's speech. It's how I move my hands. It's my tonality. It's all of those good things. And while I've done tons of media training, while public speaking is so important, understand that when it comes to organizations like this, when it comes to not even of the size of Takeda, but any proper organizations that have multiple employees and you need to communicate across multiple layers, communication isn't speech. It's a system. And if we did not have a system by which to craft this vision, to communicate to all these different stakeholders, to make sure that there's a perfect rollout, none of this happens. And so that's not one person, one day, just speaking. There's so much more that goes into it. And so for something like this to go incredibly well, the communications needed to be engineered as carefully as the deal itself. And it was, and that's why it went so well. And so if we understand that clarity isn't speech, it's a system, what is that system? How can we use it ourselves to be able to create the clarity that we want, to be able to get rid of confusion and to be able to achieve the business goals that we have? Here is that system. This is the clarity flywheel. This is the epitome of 15 years of experience and research and living this out myself to be able to crystallize what it actually takes to be able to take something that is complex from a strategic point of view, communicate it effectively across companies, communicate it both internally, communicate it externally, to make sure that everyone is bought in and that the executives that are pushing this earn the trust, earn the loyalty, and that ultimately the people who need to execute on this do so flawlessly. And there are 4 parts to this clarity flywheel. The first is design, second is discipline, third is feedback, and lastly, it is to refine. So again, I was harping about how communication is not just speech. There's so much more to that. And it all begins with the design. It has to do around the vision, the narrative, and the message. And the very first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what are we doing? What is the intent of what it is that we are undertaking? Is this a culture change, go to market? Is a leadership transition? We're bringing somebody new in. What is the intent that we have? What is taking place? What is the narrative then that we build around it? What story can we tell to help make this clearer? What messages do we need to create to be able to help people understand this really easily and so that it resonates with anyone that we speak to internally or externally? Then from there, you have audience mapping. Who needs to hear this? Who are we communicating these messages to? Who is it that we need to influence? Who is it that we need to get their buy-in? That's the audience mapping. And then lastly, we have the channel. What methods are we using to communicate to these individuals? This is the very first thing that needs to happen. This design is the very foundation for everything to do with strong communication, period. This is where it begins. Only then can we start looking at the discipline portion, which is the practice, the repetition, and the actual delivery. This is where we can start talking about what are we saying and how are we saying it? What is our tonality? What are our hand movements? All of that good stuff. That's where this stuff comes in, but not before we get the design out of the way. But the discipline we need to have, and the reason I call it discipline, is because it's not a given. It's something that requires time and effort and resources personally to make happen. So the first is putting aside the practice and delivery. Now that we know what our intent is, we know what it is that we want to say, we know who we need to say it to and how we're going to reach them, okay, practice it over and over and over again. And this is the thing where I hear so much pushback from executives. They're like, oh, I just don't have time. This is just something that like it's not as important as research or R&D or whatever it might be. There's always excuses. But I'll tell you one thing, which is that Tiger never went out cold. Kobe Bryant never started a game without warm up and practice. And if you want something to succeed, you need to put in the reps. You need to put in the time. And it doesn't mean endless time. It just means being efficient with the time that you do put in. And so that takes practice and delivery. Then we need to ensure that we have message consistency, meaning that we say this stuff over and over and over again. Not one thing 10 different ways, but the same thing 10 different times. That is where you turn a statement into something that others can believe in because they've just heard you say it over and over again. Then we need to ensure that we have manager enablement. So one of the ways and one of the reasons that you have that distortion is because you leave the communication in the hands of those who are communicating. You're not giving them the support that they need. We're not giving them the tools to be able to communicate exactly how they need to at the level that is required. So to help avoid some of that message distortion, you can think about creating specific scripts for the manager level individuals. You can have FAQs, you can have uh, rituals here that can be places in which people can ask those questions. So a ritual could be Question Tuesdays. Throw it up, on in this town hall every time we meet. You can ask questions. There's a Slack channel maybe dedicated to questions, whatever it might be. But we need to be able to practice. We need to be consistent with what we say. We need to enable others to communicate it well across the company, and we need to be able to have places that team members know they can go to ask all these different questions. Then we have the feedback, and this helps get rid of that feedback vacuum, which widens the intent to impact gap. This feedback is where we start getting information from our teams to our leadership to understand how well did this actually work? How clear were we? Not were we clear or were we not clear? How clear were we? And so we do echo checks. Part of the way we can do that is just go up to managers and leaders within the company and say, okay, what did you understand from what I, a C-suite leader or senior leadership team member, wanted from you? What is it why are we doing this? What is the vision? What is the narrative? What is the messaging? Who needs to hear this? Making sure that the different managers and leaders at different levels actually understand what it is that you want. Then we can do cascade audits. So we can check with individuals within the different levels how well it is that they heard and understood what it is that we wanted to communicate. And that can be done with surveys and so on. And even within these surveys is how we can do the last thing, which is sentiment mapping. How well was this change received? How well was this new communication captured, and how much did it resonate with people? Is it positive or negative? Because it's one thing to communicate it well. It's a second to not have it be received well in the company. And so we want to understand all of these parts so that we can get to the last part, which is refining. And the refining portion, that is where we can optimize our language and the approach so we can be better the next time around. So let's say that what we wanted to communicate was like a 5 out of 10 on the continuum in terms of how clear we were. Well, this is our chance to sharpen our messaging and make sure that we are more clear in what it is that we are saying so that more people can more easily understand. Because maybe it was just a little bit too complex, the concept we were saying. Or maybe the words we were using were way too sophisticated when we could have been just clear with the choices of vocabulary. Maybe it was a delivery. So it wasn't believed. It felt like somebody in the leadership team were just saying words. They didn't really truly believe what it is that they were saying. Or the delivery just didn't resonate because it didn't capture the attention of those that were listening. So it could be a delivery enhancement issue where we have to work on that. It could also be behavioral calibration. And when I say behavioral calibration, I mean that there is a delta or there's a gap between what was said and the behaviors that followed. So for example, if we go back to the rituals portion and we said, you know what, feedback's really important on this new cultural change. We want to hear from you. And so at the end of every call that we have, we're going to set aside 15 to 20 minutes just for questions alone. And if after that, some calls only had 5 minutes of questions or even no time for questions at all, clearly behaviors are not being followed here. And so we can change our behavior where we just actually live out what it is that we promise. And lastly, it's to be able to capture learnings. So what did we learn from this process? What went well? What could we improve? What needs to change for next time? If we can do all of that, the design, what we want to say, who we need to say it to, how we need to say it, then the discipline portion, the deliverability, the consistency in the messaging, enabling others in the company, feedback, hearing what people believe, what they didn't, what resonated with them, what didn't, making sure that the managers and individuals at different parts of the company actually understand. And then lastly, tweaking what it is that we need to do. By doing all of that, we can effectively root out and destroy confusion, and we will have fulfilled the clarity flywheel because clarity It's not a one-time action. It's something we need to do again and again and again and again for every single thing that we do at a company, and especially on those big moments. But this is how this all comes together. This is where we understand that some of the biggest issues that we have in companies, it's not the strategy, it's not the ideas, but ultimately it comes down to the ability of leaders to communicate all the way through the organization so that people understand, why are we doing this in the first place? How can I bring them along? What do they need to hear from me? How we can then, once the leaders are communicating the big change, really reduce that intent to impact gap so that it's nearly zero, and what leaders want to happen actually ends up happening. Then ensuring that there's as minimal distortion as possible as information flows from the top to the bottom, and really just following this flywheel. Design, discipline, feedback, and refine over and over and over again. That is what is going to root out confusion. It's what's going to allow you to really take complex strategy and translate it into communication that will allow you to achieve the impact that you want, earn the trust, and really be seen as that authentic leader that communicates properly. I hope you found some value in this. This is what I follow every single day. This is really the start and the finish of really bringing clarity into our organization. Hope you do the same. And until next time, keep leading with clarity.